Today we want to look at the first chapter of Daniel. In that chapter, we're given 3 keys for understanding the book of Daniel. Daniel was a captive taken to Babylon. This book was written over 500 years before the birth of Christ, and it contains what is known as apocalyptic prophecy. Apocalyptic prophecy goes from the time of the prophet down to the end with a continual historical narrative, historical continuum. Whereas classical prophecy has multiple applications, apocalyptic prophecy has only one application and goes from the prophet's day to the end. So the first key that we want to discover in chapter 1 for understanding the book of Daniel is what we call the expositive key. That's the key for the explanation of how the book is put together. And the first 4 verses say, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim king of Judah came Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon unto Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim king of Judah into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, and he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans." In these first 4 verses, then, we're shown the key for understanding the book. The book has 4 prophecies, 4 prophetic outlines, and 4 stories, 1 story for each outline. And in these first 4 verses, in this very order, it talks about the reign, that's the kingdom, the king, and the sanctuary, the house of God, and the children of Israel, or the people. So in our key for explanation of the book of Daniel in verse 4 verses is kingdom, king, sanctuary, people. In chapter 2, it'll talk about the restoration of the kingdom. In chapter 7, it'll talk about the restoration of the king. In chapters 8 and 9, it'll talk about the restoration of the sanctuary. And in chapters 10 to 12, it will give the prophetic outline for the restoration of God's people. Chapter 10, verse 14 clearly states that's what that prophecy is about. And each of these prophecies has a story. The fiery furnace corresponds to the restoration of the kingdom when the 3 Hebrew worthies were delivered from the fiery furnace. The story of the restoration of the king is that of Nebuchadnezzar when he lost his sanity and was forced to eat grass for 7 years and then was restored to his kingdom. That's chapter 4. And in chapter 5, we have Belshazzar's feast, where they used the sanctuary vessels and the candlestick from God's sanctuary. And that night, Babylon fell, Cyrus entered, and that's a picture of the restoration of the sanctuary because he decreed that take place. And in chapters 10 to 12, that prophecy is illustrated in chapter 6 of Daniel being rescued from the lion's den, the deliverance of God's people. The next key that we want to notice in chapter 1 is the interpretive key. That key we find in the following verses. The end of verse 4 says, "To stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat. nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. Then verse 11 says, Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. So in this experience, we see that these 4 Hebrew young people accepted Babylonian education. They accepted the Babylonian language, and they accepted Babylonian names. Daniel, who means God is judge, his name was changed to Prince of Baal. Hananiah means grace of God, and his name was changed to servant of Aku. That's the moon god. And Mishael, whose name means none like God, his name was changed to none like Aku. And Azariah, which means helped by God, his name was changed to servant of Nebo. That's the mountain god. So these young men accepted Babylonian education, Babylonian names, the Babylonian language, but not the Babylonian food. And that is to point us to the interpretive key, the key for interpreting, for understanding the book of Daniel. And if we turn to Leviticus in chapter 10, verse 9, Aaron and his sons were told not to drink wine, from intoxicating beverage. And so these young men took a position like Aaron and his children to not drink the wine of Babylon. And in chapter 17 of Leviticus, it says in verse 7 that any meat offered to idols was not to be eaten by God's people. And in Leviticus 17:10 it says, And whatsoever man there be of the house of Israel, or of the strangers that sojourn among you, that eateth any manner of blood, I will even set my face against that soul that eateth blood, and will cut him off from among his people. So we see that they could not eat the Babylonian food. It had been offered to idols. It still contained the blood in it, and the wine was a choice they made to live at a high standard of no intoxicating beverage. So why is it that they rejected the food of Babylon when they accepted names, language, and education? Because the Bible said so. Moses had written, and they were trained in the Word of God. And we, as we approach this book, need to take the Bible and the Bible only as our interpreter. That's the only way we're going to understand Daniel properly. Otherwise, if we jump to newspapers, to history books, without letting Daniel go step by step through his prophecies, teaching us the meaning of each of the symbols. Daniel is like education that begins with primary, goes to secondary, and then to college, and then to university. In each of his 4 prophetic outlines, there's an advance, like the waves of the incoming tide that advance each wave a little farther, so he gives us more and more detail as he proceeds. And the third key we want to consider is the key of operation. How does God operate? We call it the operative key, and we can read verses 13 and onward, beginning maybe in verse 12. Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat. And as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So he consented to them in this matter, and proved them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse. He gave them the diet they requested, a vegetarian diet. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days, that's at the end of the 3 years of education, that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. That means they were given official positions in the kingdom. And in all manner of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. And verse 21 ends the chapter, and Daniel continued even unto the 1st year of King Cyrus. So here we have what we call the operative key, which is they had a test in regard to food, a test in regard to study, and Daniel had a test in regard to service. So the food, they had a time of probation, 10 days, followed by an exam before Melzar, and the results, they were given the diet they requested. In their study, they had a time for study for 3 years, followed by appearance before the king, and then they were given official positions. And Daniel himself served 70 years, most of that time in Babylon, and then Babylon came to its fall, that crisis, that judgment night, when Belshazzar's feast was interrupted by the entrance of Cyrus and his armies. But when Cyrus came in and put Darius, his uncle, on the throne, Darius made Daniel one of the 3 presidents and eventually the prime president in the Medo-Persian Empire, showing a period of time, a final test, and a reward. So this is the way God operates: time, test, and results. And throughout the book of Daniel, each of the prophecies is going to show a period of time, followed by a final test, and then the results. So that's the operative key for understanding the book of Daniel. So we've looked at 3 keys, and in conclusion, we can say that Daniel is a book dealing with time, judgment, and its results. That's the way God operates, showing the restoration of God's kingdom, king, sanctuary, and people. That's the outline of the book. First, the restoration of the king, then of the kingdom, then of the king, then of the sanctuary, and then of the people. And Daniel is an apocalyptic book. Its prophecies contain an historical continuum from the prophet's day to the end. And we can only understand Daniel if the Bible and the Bible only is our guide. These 3 keys will guide us in the study of the book of Daniel so that we can come out with a right understanding. Thank you.